Hello, it's Saturday, the 29th of June. You're tuned into the weekend edition of Arirang News this lunchtime, bringing you a special coverage of the G20 Summit taking place in Japan as we speak. I'm Oh Soo-young in Seoul. We begin with our top story this afternoon. President Trump says he wants to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at the border separating the two Koreas. Well, nothing has been confirmed just yet, but South Korea's presidential office says any dialogue between Pyongyang and Washington is always welcome. Our Shin Se-min starts us off.
In a surprise turn, U.S. President Donald Trump offered a spontaneous invitation to North Korea's Kim Jong-un. On the day of his arrival to Seoul for a two-day summit with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, Trump says he wants to meet with Kim to shake hands and say hello in the demilitarized zone dividing the two Koreas. He tweeted, "While there, if Chairman Kim of North Korea sees this, I would meet him at the border/DMZ just to shake his hands." Shortly after his tweets, Trump said this ahead of his meeting with the Saudi Crown Prince.
I just thought of it this morning. We'll be at the area. We may go to the DMZ, or the border, as they call it. So we'll be there. And I just put out a feeler, because I don't know where he is right now. He may not be in North Korea. But I said if Chairman Kim would want to meet, I'll be at the border. It's certainly, we seem to get along very well. I can tell you, we seem to.
During a short coffee break ahead of the last G20 session, both Moon and Trump reportedly spoke about his tweet. South Korea's presidential office said Trump gave Moon a thumbs up and told him that they'll work together. But the White House has declined to comment about any potential meeting beyond the president's tweet. And South Korea's presidential spokesperson, too, shortly after the remarks, told reporters that nothing has been decided, but added that there's no change in Seoul's position in welcoming the resumption of North Korea-U.S. dialogue. With a tweet, Trump has also confirmed that he'll be visiting the DMZ while in South Korea, which many had speculated he would do. His attempt to pay a surprise visit to the DMZ back in 2017 was foiled by bad weather, which was too dangerous to fly in by helicopter. Both Moon and Trump will begin their pivotal diplomatic encounter this weekend after wrapping up their respective schedules at the G20 Summit in Japan. Upon their arrival in Seoul on this Saturday, the two leaders may hold a dinner banquet at the Blue House and hold bilateral talks the following day. With Trump's impulsive character making nuclear diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula all the more fluid, there's fresh speculation that Kim and Trump could indeed meet at the DMZ, making another historical meeting between the two. Shin Se-min, Arirang News, Osaka.
Well, President Trump's planned visit to the demilitarized zone on Sunday will make him the fifth U.S. president to do so. Our Kan Young-woo takes us through the history of U.S. leaders visiting the DMZ and the significance behind their trips.
In November 1983, Ronald Reagan made a trip to observation post Olet just south of the military demarcation line separating the two Koreas. He looked at the north through binoculars, becoming the first sitting U.S. president to travel to the DMZ. In a speech to American troops at Camp Liberty Bell, Reagan said they stand between the free world and the armed forces of a system that is hostile to everything Americans believe in, calling them the front lines of freedom. Bill Clinton's trip to the DMZ in July 1993 came when tensions were high between Pyongyang and Washington, with North Korea leaving the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty 4 months earlier. Clinton even visited the Bridge of No Return that crosses the military demarcation line in the Joint Security Area. His warning message to Pyongyang was loud and clear. If North Korea develops nuclear weapons, the regime will be erased from the earth. 9 years later, George W. Bush visited the DMZ in February 2002, a month after he named the North as a part of an axis of evil during his State of the Union address. But Bush toned down his words after his visit to the DMZ. At a joint press conference with South Korea's then-President Kim Dae-jung, Bush said he was deeply concerned about a country that is not transparent, allows its people to starve, and develops weapons of mass destruction. He added that both Seoul and Washington have no intention of attacking Pyongyang. When Barack Obama paid a visit to the DMZ in March 2012, he told U.S. troops that the contrast between South and North Korea could not be starker, saying that the differences in prosperity and freedom between the two Koreas were striking. Also referring to Pyongyang's announcement of its intention to conduct a missile launch after it had agreed to suspend long-range missile launches in exchange for food aid from Washington, Obama warned that North Korea will achieve nothing by threats or provocations, and the missile launch would make it even more isolated than it already is. 간영우, Arirang News.
President Moon is wrapping up his schedule at the G20 Summit in Osaka. During his 3-day visit, the president unveiled his roadmap for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Our Park Hee-jun files this report from Osaka.
President Moon Jae-in's G20 diplomacy in Osaka focused on rallying support for his peace drive on the Korean Peninsula and trying to decipher North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's thoughts regarding nuclear negotiations. Early on Saturday, President Moon sat down for crucial talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin, having met Chairman Kim in Vladivostok back in April, briefed his South Korean counterpart on the discussions that took place. According to a Blue House spokesperson, Putin spoke of Kim's emphasis on the importance of North Korea's security issues in the negotiations, and that there needs to be corresponding measures in exchange for denuclearization.
According to President Putin, Chairman Kim had emphasized that guarantees of North Korean security is essential, as well as corresponding measures in return for denuclearization.
The details on what those measures are were not revealed, but an official at the top office says the two may have discussed it during their brief one-on-one. This, combined with Thursday's sit-down with Chinese President Xi Jinping, might have given President Moon some pretty good clues on where Kim might stand on the nuclear front. During the South Korea-China summit, she reassured Moon that Kim is still willing to give up its nuclear capabilities and hopes to improve inter-Korean ties. From these meetings, President Moon gathered support for his efforts for peace and denuclearization from key players in the nuclear talks. Both China and Russia have promised to play a constructive role in achieving South Korea's goal. And knowing where the North Korean leader stands, this should help President Moon better facilitate the talks, particularly for his meeting with President Trump beginning today. The next step for President Moon is to relay the messages from China and Russia to President Trump. His achievements in Osaka will be determined by the message President Trump sends to North Korea during his Seoul visit. For South Korea, the future direction of talks with the North appear to hinge more on its post-G20 diplomacy. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News, Osaka.
Now, included among officials accompanying Trump to South Korea are his top nuclear negotiators. They have been relaying Washington's hopes of resuming talks with North Korea while urging Pyongyang to also make a move. Well, will President Donald Trump go with the flow, or will he surprise observers once again with his rather unpredictable antics? Our Lee Ji-won has more.
National Security Advisor John Bolton, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Special Representative for North Korea Stephen Biegun. The trifecta of key U.S. officials representing Washington in its nuclear talks with North Korea are expected to gather in Seoul for President Donald Trump's summit with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Nuclear envoy Biegun arrived in Seoul a few days earlier to hold talks with his South Korean counterpart, and Pompeo and Bolton are expected to fly in from Japan alongside President Trump, fresh off the G20 summit. The hawkish hardliner Bolton said earlier this month that he believes a third summit between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is entirely possible. He said the U.S. is ready to hold a summit and that it can take place at any time the North desires. Secretary Pompeo, in response to questions on the exchange of personal letters between Trump and Kim, said a few days ago that he is hopeful it'll provide a good foundation for the two sides to restart talks. He added reports coming out of North Korea on it suggest there's a good possibility of working-level talks happening soon. Meanwhile, Biegun seemed to relay Washington's flexibility on its negotiations with the North. On Friday, during talks with South Korean nuclear envoy Lee Do-hun, Biegun said the U.S. is ready to negotiate with North Korea to implement the Singapore Agreement in a parallel and simultaneous way. Many experts saw this as Washington's effort to bring the North back to the negotiating table and narrow their gap in achieving peace, denuclearization, and normalization of diplomatic ties with the North. With President Trump to discuss North Korean issues with President Moon, eyes are on whether his message will be a rehash of what his aides have been saying, or if he has something completely new to break the current impasse with Pyongyang. 이지원, Arirang News.
Well, US President Donald Trump tweeted from Japan on Saturday morning that he's willing to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at the demilitarized zone between the two Koreas. To help us read between the lines of this rather surprising tweet, we have on the line Dr Joseph Bosco, who served as a national security consultant in the US Office of the Secretary of Defense. Thanks for joining us today. Well,
very nice to be with you.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Trump's latest message comes after he rather cryptically said that he won't be meeting with Kim this time around. At the same time, both sides have been flaunting their pen-pal relationship to the world. Well, what do you make of President Trump's latest tweet? Can we expect a third round of nuclear talks in the near future?
I think anyone who would try to predict what will happen with the relationship between President Trump and Kim Jong-un would be risking a lot. One has to admit that the instincts of the president and his unique negotiating style, as well as the work of his excellent national security team, have brought us to this point where we still have hope that there will be a breakthrough in the denuclearization issue. But it remains to be seen whether the chemistry between the two can override the fundamental differences on the substance that is the real issue.
I see. Well, before Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi sat down for a meeting at the G20 in a bid to cool down their trade tensions, the Chinese leader visited North Korea, which was largely interpreted as a form of messaging and pressure. Do you think this worked? And do you see Beijing playing a greater role in the denuclearization talks going forward?
Well, when you say, you ask, do I think it works? The question is, works for whom or for which side? China has been a key player in the entire North Korea nuclear issue for years and really decades, and it has not been a constructive role that they've played. They have taken every step to defer and delay and diminish the impact of sanctions on North Korea. They've protected them in the Security Council and elsewhere diplomatically. They've argued to the West, to Washington, that the problem of North Korea is our problem, that is the West's problem, not China's, and therefore that concessions need to be made to North Korea in order to make progress. So their role has not been a constructive one. I hope it will change now, thanks to President Trump's pressure on China itself, but that is a key missing link in the relationship.
I see. Well, Trump and Kim's second summit in Hanoi earlier this year, as you know, ended early with no deal. If we do see a third summit soon, then do you think it will be third time lucky? Will both sides be more prepared this time around?
I think both sides were prepared, and I'm not sure that luck is the determining factor. The real question is whether President Trump's determination to achieve denuclearization will be realized based on what Kim told him in Singapore, that denuclearization was definitely in the cards. Whether that was a serious statement of intent by North Korea or simply a ploy to reduce the sanctions remains to be seen. But hopefully, from the U.S. perspective, one hopes that the president will hold firm to the basic U.S. position and, in fact, if anything, escalate or increase the sanctions, including secondary sanctions on China, which is significantly diminishing the impact of the sanctions on North Korea.
I see. Dr. Joseph Bosco, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Well, all eyes are on the G20 meeting taking place in Osaka as the leaders of the US and China once again sit down to work out a truce on the almost year-long trade war. Our Ko Roon-hee walks us through the timeline of the trade conflict between the world's two biggest economies.
The writing was on the wall even before President Trump took office. Back in 2016 at a rally in Indiana, Trump, the presidential candidate, signaled a possible trade war with China, saying, quote, "We can't continue to allow China to rape our country." After Trump became president, he started using tariffs as a means to reduce U.S. trade deficits with China, which amounted to around $420 billion last year. In January 2018, Trump slapped tariffs on imported washing machine and solar panels, including those from China. China retaliated in April by imposing tariffs on about $3 billion worth of American goods. Although the two sides met for high-level trade talks in May, they could not find a resolution to the dispute. Trade tensions between the two countries have steadily risen since the second half of 2018. Washington and Beijing each imposed tariffs on $360 billion worth of one another's goods between last July and early June. Products affected by tariffs include vegetables, clothing, and machinery. Analysts say the trade war has hurt Beijing's coffers more than it has Washington, given that China's exports to the U.S. was more than quadruple than that of shipments going the other way in 2018. And China's GDP growth has been signaling the impact. Last year, the Chinese economy grew by 6.6%, its slowest pace since 1990. On the other hand, the U.S. posted a GDP growth of 2.9% in 2018, the best annual gain since 2015. The trade spat has also led to uncertainties in the global financial markets, dashing investor confidence around the world. 고르니, Arirang News.
The Trump administration's blacklisting of Chinese tech giant Huawei has been a source of heated tensions between the US and China. The fallout has hurt many economies around the world, and among the hardest hit is South Korea and its exporting firms, Kim Dami reports.
Sandwiched between the two economic superpowers, South Korean firms are reeling into the aftermath of the U.S. ban on Huawei products. In response to Trump's blacklisting of Huawei, the Chinese tech giant reportedly warned numerous IT companies of dire consequences if they cooperate with the ban. The warning extends to South Korea's IT powerhouses, including Samsung Electronics and SK hynix. Considering their high level of dependence on Huawei, Beijing's warning is not to be trifled with. Huawei accounts for 12% of SK hynix's total revenues, some $4 billion worth of semiconductors like NAND flash memory chips. Huawei is also a loyal customer of Samsung Electronics, especially in semiconductors and displays. Huawei's recent struggles in the mobile phone sector could lead to a falling demand, which in turn translates into falling chip prices as semiconductor inventories pile up. And it's not just Korea's bread and butter semiconductor industry that is being threatened. If Apple's iPhone sales drop in China due to the effects of the U.S.-China trade war, Korean camera module products and OLED panels supplied to Apple will also be cut dramatically. Numerous mid-sized companies in South Korea rely on the export of electronic components and communication equipment to Huawei. Analysts say the fortunes of South Korean firms, both big and small, hinge on the outcome of the trade talks between Washington and Beijing. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
The summit talks between US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping started a short while ago. And to talk about the key issues more in detail, I'm joined in the studio by the Director for Chinese Studies at the Sejong Institute, Dr. Lee. Welcome. And to my left is our very own business correspondent, Kim Hae-sung. So Hae-sung, let's start with you first. So who else is at this very high-stakes meeting, and what are some of the key sticking points here?
As President Trump and Xi and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He are present at the meeting. But as for these trade talks, it's more than just reducing U.S. trade surplus deficit against China, which is at $420 billion in 2018. Over the past months, the two have made progress on services, currency, agriculture, and non-tariff barriers to trade. It seemed like they were close to reaching a deal until President Trump accused Beijing of backtracking on previous agreements in May. The sticking points right now are over how to enforce U.S. intellectual property protection, prevent forced tech transfers, and U.S. demands on China to make structural changes like cutting subsidies for its state-owned companies. For China, it doesn't want those changes written into law, saying it would undermine its sovereignty. It also wants the U.S. to remove tariffs on Chinese imports. Trump did tell reporters in Osaka Friday that he expects a productive discussion with Xi, but the differences between the two sides are big. It's more like a tech war over who will dominate future high-tech industries. Take a listen to what President Trump said at his G20 opening speech on Friday.
Trade, we must also ensure the resilience and security of our 5G networks. This is essential to our shared safety and prosperity. Further, the United States opposes data localization and policies.
Well, thank you, Haesung, for bringing us up to speed. Well, earlier this week, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin actually projected a bit of optimism, saying that a trade deal was 90% complete. But then Mr. Trump came out and said that he is willing to impose extra tariffs if things go wrong. So my question to you, Director, is whether you see a conclusive deal coming out of this meeting.
Well, I think I completely agree with Haesung that it is not just about trade. It is more than that. And I think now the issue is becoming an issue of credibility and trust, because what Haesung just mentioned about intellectual property rights, cyber theft, but how the issue is how U.S. can trust China to implement these measures. So U.S. is asking China to change the law, but change the laws means that it touches upon the national sovereignty issues. For example, the reform of SOE, state-owned enterprises, provides money to Chinese Communist Party, and asking the reform of Chinese state-owned enterprises is like cutting off your arm and dying, bleeding to die. So it's very hard for Chinese to honor the U.S. request. So it's going to be a long-term ordeal. And I think there are three possibilities. One is divorce. Second is shaking their hands together, smiling at the camera, and walk away. The three and say that, oh, we agreed to resume our negotiations. The third is a modest compromise. Anything is possible because Trump is unpredictable.
Well, the rest of the world has also been affected by this almost year-long trade dispute, and that's especially true here in South Korea. South Korea has been walking on eggshells, trying to balance the demands of its top security ally, the United States, as well as the demands of its top trade partner, China. So my next question to you, Haesung, is what the impact has been on the world economy as well as South Korean businesses.
Right, so far the two sides have imposed tariffs on a total of $360 billion worth of goods one another. So it does affect U.S. and Chinese consumers who are hit by higher prices. But it's more than that, because the two are the biggest economies in the world, so it affects global supply chains, hurting production and lowering investment. For a figure, the IMF said current and threatened U.S.-China trade tariffs could cut global GDP for the next year by 0.5% or $455 billion. That's a loss larger than G20 member South Africa's annual economic output. The IMF says South Korea, with exports accounting for half of its GDP, is the most vulnerable to the trade war, followed by Germany and Japan. In fact, South Korea's exports have fallen for 7 straight months amid slowing global trade, and a report by the Korea International Trade Association says U.S. tariffs on China could lower South Korea's exports by 0.14%. But then again, it's not just trade. President Trump's blacklisting of Chinese tech firm Huawei also creates a tricky situation for local Korean companies like Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, which export chips to Huawei. So I know you are an expert on this, Dr. Lee, who just came back from a tour of Huawei headquarters in Shenzhen, China yesterday. So what was the mood like in China, and how is this trade spat really affecting Korean companies?
Well, first of all, Huawei is a really big place. It's half the size of Yeouido, one district in Seoul, and it has more than 100 buildings. It has a lake, it has towers, it has castles, almost like castles. So, and I think by talking to the people, executives there, my impression is that, one, they think that the U.S. attack on Huawei is politically motivated. I'm saying this as a Chinese side argument. The second is that while they placing their hope that the G20 Summit will deliver Huawei from their ordeal, current ordeal, but then they also at the same time preparing for long-haul struggle, this tech war that you just mentioned, so that they think that even though Huawei will struggle for the next 2 or 3 years, but then it will technologically innovate. It has artificial intelligence lab that employs 400 PhDs around the globe, and they are catching up. And also they make good products that will make consumers choose Huawei. Whatever political claims there might be, if Huawei will be able to produce good product, then it will be at the end of the day, consumers will stay with Huawei. I think that's their strategy, so that Huawei is ready for long-term struggle for this U.S.-China trade war. It is not just trade war, as you mentioned, but it's more like a part of a bigger competition for global leadership, as we experts will see.
How does it affect Korean companies then, like Korean chip makers that ship to Huawei? Because U.S. blacklisting of Huawei also affects Korea, right?
So Trump will come to Seoul, and he will meet some of the major South Korean company executives. This is the first time the U.S. president will have such kind of meetings. And I think the number one concern already is that what if Trump mentions about Huawei and pressure South Korean companies? Even if he doesn't say it's a pressure, but I think they feel the heat to avoid Huawei. But then Huawei has already very close relationship with the South Korean companies. And also, we cannot just choose one over the other, US over China or China over United States. So this is a very difficult time for South Korea, where we have very close relationship with both countries. South Korea's, China and the United States takes 40% of South Korea's entire global export. So South Korea will buckle up, will face some very difficult time. One of the Singaporean friend that I just also came back from Southeast Asia asked, what is your strategy in your case? That's that smaller countries like South Korea and Singapore, other countries, sometimes there is no way out. You just have to be ready for take some beatings from big countries. Maybe that is a solution when you don't have a solution.
Well, since the trade dispute, businesses not only in China and America, but around the world have been suffering from the impact, and they've had to rethink their supply chains, production lines, and even their long-term business strategies. And so the question is, even with a deal between Trump and Xi, will things ever be the same? What does it look like in the future?
It's already not the same. Many people say when the crisis will come. I tell them we are already in the middle of a crisis. So they say when it will end. We just started. I tell them it just started. So I think we should not be naive about this. Even though politicians say, the global cooperation. Of course, we want to see the global cooperation between the two companies, two big giants. But then we also face the reality. And what is very likely scenario is that bipolarity in the future, as countries will be forced to choose between U.S. and China, and there is one pole that is a U.S.-centered pole that countries will side with the United States. The other pole group is countries will side with China, particularly many Southeast Asian countries. So that, but for South Korea, because we have very good and robust and important relations with both China and the United States. So South Korea is very vulnerable in this situation. So that I think this is a time for wisdom, for what we should tide over this crisis that we are facing.
I see, but even with a deal, many say that beneath the surface of this trade war, the two economic giants are actually engaged in a power struggle. And of course, President Xi has his Made in China 2025 vision, and President Trump has promised to make America great again, and he's also looking to his 2020 elections. So between these two polar opposite ideologies, is a compromise even possible? Can there be a positive sum game?
I think you already answered the question. That is, it's increasingly becoming impossible and difficult to compromise because Trump wants to make America great. Xi Jinping wants to great rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation by year 2050. So both sides cannot back down, and there's also domestic audience they're waiting for and cheering up. You should not back down. Even China is suffering for this time. When I go to China, they think that our leaders should not back down. This is a great heroic struggle. So At the first, it was more about trade imbalance. It was about import and export, but it is increasingly becoming a power struggle between the two great powers. So I think probably South Korea also should be ready for long-term preparations to tide over these kind of challenges that is unprecedented in South Korea's history for the last 1 century.
I see. Well, the US-China conflict is set to hit its 1-year mark in exactly 1 week from now. So a deal today would be very significant indeed. Well, that's where we'll have to leave the discussion for now. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining the programme. This is also where we'll end the programme for now, but our special coverage of the G20 Summit, as well as President Trump's visit to South Korea, will continue throughout the weekend. Our next newscast is at 3 p.m. Korea time, so do stay tuned into Arirang News. In the meantime, have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.